Hi everyone, Samir and Samit here, and welcome back to our F1 podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Spanish Grand Prix.
And this was actually a pretty exciting race for once, and I think that's due to the new track changes.
So if you didn't hear, for this year's race at the Spanish GP, they removed that ugly final chicane. And
Yeah,
so that meant it would be two really fast right-handers to end out the lap. And so we saw then in the race that added a lot more overtaking opportunities
yeah,
down the front straight.
definitely. Yeah. There was also this new thing that we would see in the free practices. There's actually a bump on the very last corner, which the drivers never noticed last year because you're coming so slowly last year when the chicane was there. But now that you're going almost flat out in the previous corners, now you actually notice the bump there. So all the drivers were noticing that now, and that played an important role in setups.
Yeah, it caused a lot of issues for some drivers too. It caught a lot of drivers out unexpected, like we'll explain later on. But
Yeah.
just another thing to negotiate. But it had a lot of mixed reviews. Like some drivers, like I think Lando Norris was saying it's gonna be like he wouldn't like it. He said at first because it would be a lot more strain on the neck and stuff. But then Lewis Hamilton said he would like it because he thinks it would make racing a lot better. So a lot of mixed reviews going into
Yeah.
it, but I think overall it was a great addition from the race organizers.
Yeah. So moving on into FP1 then, Max Verstappen once again in red hot form at the moment, just looking quicker and quicker, and he had the fastest time of the session so far on this, even on this new track layout, which I think would suit the Red Bulls even more just because there's just more pace coming from them. But immediately we saw the previous lap records being shattered,
Hmm.
just as because of how quick the new track was. So just people were constantly setting new lap records and everything. But it was just FP1 was mostly just about the drivers getting used to the new layout of this track.
Yeah, gaining confidence obviously because with the simulations and stuff, you can take that new corner flat out, but then you'd have to lift off in the final corner, and
Yeah,
so drivers was just getting more and more confidence. But we saw drivers like Sergio Perez
yeah,
and Lando Norris both complaining about porpoising going into that final corner,
because of
just
that bump.
yeah,
Yeah.
because of the bump, and so teams would have to like change setups to negotiate that final corner to allow the drivers to get as much speed as they can coming out of that corner.
Yeah, we saw McLaren once again running their Triple Crown livery this weekend in Spain, just as they did in Monaco. So it's always nice to see that, but of course, not nice to see on the Alpine when we saw Esteban Ocon into the final corner. He lost a bit of body work just running slightly wide off of that curb onto that double curb, is what that's called, the green and then the red. And he just lost a little bit of body work, so that's not what he needed, but he was soon back running and setting good laps again.
Yeah, Barcelona has a lot of really like big curves, and so what that does is like even if you go a little bit wide, that will definitely hurt your underbody, your floor of your car. And so you would see a lot of drivers like careful not to go over the track limits, but also because the FIA are being really strict about it this weekend to make sure drivers don't get unfair advantages. They were really strict on that all weekend through all the practice, qualifying,
Yeah.
and the race.
Yeah, we also saw an incident in FP1 between Pierre Gasly and Logan Sargent into that corner that was remodeled in 2021 right off of the end of the second DRS straight. So I guess Gasly just tried to go up the inside of Sargent, but Sargent didn't see Gasly at all in the mirrors. So they came close together and touched a little bit, but there wasn't too much damage at all. Sargent just reported he touched with Gasly, so and there was luckily no damage at all. So they both got away with that one.
Yeah, and now also going on to the person who was in also really hot form this season, Fernando
Yeah.
Alonso, who again looked decently quick, although he was almost a second off the pace set by Max Verstappen in FP1. Alonso finished sixth, and but his teammate Lance Stroll finished all the way down in 15th. So it was kind of what we've been seeing all season, but
Yeah.
Alonso had been a bit slower than we'd normally seen in the previous races. So it was a little bit doubt of how good Fernando Alonso would be after this FP1 session,
Yeah.
but he said it was just because he was getting used to the new tracks and everything. So there was still hopes in the Aston Martin garage that Alonso could do well in his home race.
Yeah, so at the end of FP1, then it was Max Verstappen who finished in P1 ahead of Sergio Perez, Esteban Ocon in really good form after his podium in Monaco. So now he's finished third here. Then surprisingly, Nick De Vries is up in P4. That's what he needed to give him some good confidence so that he can so that he can get into a good run of form, so that he can keep his AlphaTauri seat. Then it was Pierre Gasly in fifth, Alonso sixth, Magnussen 7th, Leclerc 8th, Sainz ninth, and George Russell in 10th in FP1.
Yeah, and also one thing too is that Science was the car that was running the upgrades in FP1, so he
Yeah.
was the only one with the upgraded parts. Leclerc didn't have them, and so that was so that Ferrari could use Leclerc as a basis to Science to see how well the upgrades would actually compare. And then
Yeah.
after that in FP2, both cars received the upgrades.
Yeah. So moving on into FP2, then once again, Max Verstappen was just absolutely flying, and he set another fastest lap with a time of a 113.9. So you're just in super form in that Red Bull car and on the soft tires. It just looked like no one was going to be able to stop him. People got close, but they couldn't really get close enough. So Verstappen was just he's even joking on the radio about hearing Helmut Marko's phone while his engineer was trying to talk to him. So he's just enjoying life right now, driving an F1 car. Nothing's really phasing him at the moment, and rightly so.
Yeah, exactly. We saw this too, like with Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton's dominance, Sebastian Vettel's dominance,
Yeah.
even Michael Schumacher.
Yeah, just drivers when they get into this type of zone, they're just enjoying it. Of course, it's not good for the people who are trying to catch up, but it's definitely good if you're the team and the driver enjoying all of it.
Hmm.
So Fernando Alonso, he actually stepped it up this session too. He finished in P2 this session
That's more like
behind, yeah, behind Max Verstappen by 1/10 of a second too. So it wasn't that big of a gap. So he did get close, but obviously, and especially on his home race where everyone wanted him to get that next win. Everyone was chanting this
33.
weekend 33, yeah, so he could get win number 33. But yeah, we would just have to wait and see because at the moment, the Red Bulls just look really quick.
Yeah, but the for me the shock of the session and probably one of the greatest performances this session, although be it an FP2 session, Nico Hulkenberg bringing his
Yeah,
Haas up to P3. What an
yeah,
incredible lap he had to bring him up to P3. Just 2/10
definitely,
off
yeah,
Verstappen in that Haas car. I mean, yes, a lot of cars don't have aren't doing the same run plans as the Haas team probably, but it was still really nice to see Hulkenberg up in P3. Although I don't think the Haas really is that quick around here because Kevin Magnussen in the same car he finished down in 15th, and
yeah.
so Hulkenberg, I mean, probably just that was his one lap greatness showing there, but I think it might be a bit lower where Haas would expect to be.
Yeah, we saw an incident between George Russell and Oscar Piastri at the same corner where Sargent and Gasly came together. Russell was just right behind Piastri, and Piastri was on the racing line, so Russell had to like kind of avoid it and counter it, and he just locked his rear axles and he went straight into the gravel. But luckily, he was able to keep the engine going, and he didn't stall out his car, so luckily he was able to keep going.
Yeah, and before that, we saw again Sainz running a bit wide, and then
Yeah.
that caused him to scratch the floor of his car. So the he had to pit and for his engineers to check that. And so again, just the Barcelona curbs punishing drivers who go a bit too wide.
Yeah, there was also a piece of bodywork that flew off of Norris's car down the main straight, but it wasn't too severe. And we also saw another driver, Logan Sargent, going wide. Right before the new corner where the old chicane was, that turn he just after the very long right hander, he just ran wide and he clipped the gravel, but he didn't lose the rear end. He was able to keep going, and he also tried to get racy with the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg into turn one, but Hulkenberg was having none of it, and he just kept his foot to the floor around the outside of Sargent, and that was that.
Yeah.
So
But In the end, it was Max Verstappen who finished P1 ahead of Fernando Alonso and Nico Hulkenberg in third. So great laps from the Aston Martin and Haas drivers. Then
Yeah.
Sergio Perez came fourth ahead of Esteban Ocon, and then the two Ferraris, sixth and seventh, Leclerc ahead of Sainz, followed by George Russell eighth, Valtteri Bottas ninth, and Pierre Gasly tenth in his Alpine, and Russell eighth and Hamilton 11th. That was not a good session for Mercedes, especially when they brought upgrades to this track.
Yeah. But moving on into FP3, then right before qualifying, this is then where we saw some true pace, and this is where we saw a competitive leaderboard. But during this session, there were some changing conditions, and during those changing conditions, we saw Logan Sargent clip the curb at the entry of the very last corner, the corner that now has the bump. Sargent was trying to take it flat out, and he clipped the curb, and he went into the gravel and shunted his Williams into the wall there. So not at all what he needed. After some pretty, let's say, not great performances so far this weekend,
Yeah.
crashing right before qualifying is not at all what you need as a driver to keep your confidence up.
And also, it puts pressure on the mechanics because they have to get that car turned around in
Yeah.
time for qualifying.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad of a shunt, so he would be able to take part in qualifying, but he would not get that extra bit of running in FP3.
But in FP3, we did see a lot of good running from the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton, who was trying to do his best to show those upgrades, and those upgrades did show in FP3 because Hamilton
Yeah,
finished third and Russell finished sixth. So it was a good session from the Mercedes, although the Red Bulls still looked to be flying out in front, Verstappen ahead of Perez, and we saw even one of them trying to do some slipstream tests by
yeah,
staying behind Hamilton's Mercedes to see how the toe worked down the front straight, and it would be
yeah,
really powerful around here, especially now with those two fast right-handers for the final two turns. So
yeah.
DRS would help a lot.
Yeah, towards the end of the session, it did start raining, and we did see some cars like one of the McLarens of Lando Norris going out on the intermediate tires. So there was enough rain for inters, but definitely not full wets.
But we saw Stroll on the intermediate tires.
Yeah,
He went off at what was it? He went off at it was turn five, and so it wasn't too wet, but
yeah,
it was in that phase where it was just too dry for the inters,
yeah,
and so he just couldn't brake properly because the inters were just melting from that too high of a temperature, and so Stroll just went off, and so they had to pit him to change the tires and adjust his setup.
yeah. So at the end of FP3, then a much more competitive leaderboard. It was Verstappen in P1, Perez in P2, 2 tenths back on his teammate. Hamilton in third, Sainz fourth, Alonso fifth, Russell sixth, Leclerc seventh, Bottas eighth, Sonoda ninth, and Norris in 10th, sneaking that McLaren up there.
So now going on to qualifying, and the first thing we saw when Fernando Alonso started his first lap, the same corner where Sargent had his crash, turn 14, Alonso had lost the rear, and so he had to counter, and he went into the gravel, but he was able to save his car. But
Yeah,
it caused major damage to his floor. Well, not major, but substantial damage, and so they had to like tape it up, and so he lost definitely a bit of performance.
yeah,
So that would hamper his qualifying. And then because of the rain in between FP3 and qualifying, a lot of the track was still wet. And one place that was really wet was turn 11. And so we saw almost all the drivers have a scare at turn 11, both Alpha Tauris and George Russell.
as well as Valtteri Bottas too. Just when they're trying to pick up the power there, they just get caught out there, and then it just almost like you turn traction control off, and you're just like full wheel spinning,
But
and they just
they do have
lost.
traction
Yeah, they do
control
have
off.
it traction control off, but they just went off, and Bottas beached it in the gravel, but luckily he was able to keep going. And we also saw Alex Albon lose the rear of his car at the same place Stroll did in FP3. He just went brake too late and locked the rear axles. But luckily he was able to keep going.
Yeah,
And Nick De Vries as well. On his second run, he made the same exact mistake in the same corner as well.
there was still a patch of water on that section of the track,
Yeah.
but still, it was not at all what he wanted.
Yeah, so towards the end of Q1, then the track was starting to ramp up, and we saw Hulkenberg go quickest ahead of Pierre Gasly. So as the drivers came to cross the line, then Charles Leclerc he only went up into P11.
And Leclerc was struggling a lot
Leclerc
in
was struggling a
qualifying.
lot, yeah. So then we saw Sonoda go up to P7, then Ocon go up to P2. So at the moment it's Hulkenberg, Ocon, and Gasly. It's just Q1, but still that was definitely a grid that I wanted to see. But then we saw Norris pip Nico Hulkenberg by a tenth. Then Russell went up to P2. Then Hamilton out of nowhere by 3/10 of a second went quickest overall. Sainz went P4, and Leclerc was now down in the relegation zone. And Perez had just escaped in P15th after Zhou Guanyu went up into P10. So the five that we lost from Q1 were Logan Sargent, Charles Leclerc, Alex Albon, Kevin Magnussen, and Valtteri Bottas.
But also, Pierre Gasly would be investigated
Yeah,
after for impeding Max Verstappen. And we saw Alonso on the radio. He was saying that Alpine definitely needs to be penalized. That should be 3 places because he
yeah,
massively impeded the Red Bull. That was
yeah,
funny from Alonso.
yeah. But the big shock was Charles Leclerc. He got out in Q1.
Disappointing.
That's such a disappointment for him and Ferrari after they brought the new upgrades as well. So just like he was having problems with his suspension and it just was not working out for him at all.
He said there was something though fundamentally wrong that changed after um FP3, and so
Yeah.
it was really strange for Ferrari. They would have to take apart that car overnight, so and start from the
Yeah.
pit lane as to see whether they could fix that issue or not.
Yeah. So then into Q2, then with 2 minutes to go, we saw Sergio Perez go straight on into the gravel there on his what was supposed to be his final run of the session, and so he lost out on that run massively. Then we saw the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg go P4 again. Hulkenberg was just flying around this Barcelona circuit. Lando Norris then went up to P2 by 1/100th of a second behind Max Verstappen, also blitzed the final sector, so he went purple in the final sector. Then Zhou Guanyu stayed in P11, so his qualifying was done. Then Fernando Alonso crossed the line and went up into P8, and then Oscar Piastri went up to P6. So both McLarens were showing a lot of pace in qualifying, and Sergio Perez on his very last run, he just did not have the tire wear left, and he lost out on Q3 by 5/100ths of a second, and so did surprisingly George Russell as well.
So two major surprises: Russell in the upgraded Mercedes and Sergio Perez in the Red Bull. Both of them out. It was really a big surprise. I mean, Russell was a surprise because that was just pure pace, but then Perez like he crashed. So.
Yeah, but the thing about Russell was that on he had an incident with Lewis Hamilton just before the final run, and so Hamilton I guess Russell did not see him, and Hamilton tried to pass Russell into turn one, and they ended up making contact, and Hamilton's front wing broke off. But that was very interesting, and I saw what Nico Rosberg had to say about it. He said that yes, Russell should apologize, but Hamilton should also have to apologize because if Hamilton did go ahead and get in front of Russell, then he had just ruined Russell's lap because that would have then Russell would have had nowhere to go, and then he would just been stuck in the dirty air behind Lewis Hamilton. So that was a really interesting point from Rosberg.
Yeah, but it was because Hamilton thought Hamilton was trying to pick up the slipstream from the Ferrari ahead, but Russell was also trying to do that. And then I guess Hamilton
Yeah,
thought that Russell had probably backed off on his lap or
yeah.
something. And so it was just miscommunication, and so Mercedes would work to debrief that.
Yeah, so the five that we lost from Q2 were Yuki Tsunoda, Nick De Vries, Zhou Guanyu, George Russell, and Sergio Perez.
Really surprising. Then going on now to Q3, Verstappen again just lighting up the timing sheets, going fastest, ahead of surprisingly Esteban Ocon, who was P2. But then again, we hadn't seen the real challengers, and when they showed up, Sainz could only go behind Ocon in P3, and then Norris went up to P2, which
Yeah,
was really a big surprise for that McLaren. and so that was really nice to see. Although it was still a second and 3/10 off Verstappen's pace, so it
Yeah.
just showed Verstappen was in another league of his own right
Yeah.
now.
And Hamilton went up into P2, but that was still 9 tenths off Verstappen. Then Hulkenberg went up into P3, just barely behind Hamilton. Alonso also could not beat Hulkenberg. Then we saw Sainz go into P2, 5 tenths behind Verstappen, so that was getting more competitive. Stroll then in the very final runs, Stroll went up to P3. Ocon then went up to P4. Then Norris out of nowhere went up into P3. And then Hamilton and Verstappen were waiting to complete their runs. Piastri could only manage P10, so he was going to start P10. Lewis Hamilton went up then to P5. That was a really good qualifying from him. And Max Verstappen didn't need to improve anymore because he had bagged pole position in Spain again.
Yep, and Gasly also P4 in his Alpine, so that would be a really good start for him, as also we thought,
Yeah,
because we found out later that Gasly would get a sixth place grid penalty for two impedings in
yeah,
qualifying total, so he would start P10, and then after that we saw Logan Sargent and Charles Leclerc start from the pit lane after
yeah,
both of them decided we're on the back row of the grid, might as well take the car apart
yeah.
and see if we can maximize the setup so we can have a better race.
Yeah. So the starting grid then in the top 10 would look Max Verstappen in pole, Sainz P2, Norris P3, Hamilton P4, Stroll P5, Ocon 6th, Hulkenberg 7th, Alonso 8th, Piastri 9th, and then Pierre Gasly in 10th. So moving on into the race then, at lights out, we saw a good start from Carlos Sainz, who looked like he was going to be challenging Max Verstappen, but Verstappen just had that edge starting from pole position and he went ahead. But Sainz then used the slipstream to try to go to the outside and try to go around the outside of Verstappen, but Verstappen broke that fraction later and he was able to keep that position by forcing Sainz wide. And then Hamilton and Norris we saw meanwhile come close together and make some contact with each other, and we saw some bodywork fly off, and Norris started dropping through the field.
Yeah, Norris got that body damage. He or his front wing damage. It was a bit too ambitious from the young Brit, but then again, Hamilton had to slam on the brakes. So it was just a lap one incident, and that caught Norris out aware. Maybe Norris shouldn't have stuck his nose in there, but then again, hard to judge when you're going at such high speeds. And so that was a real shame for Lando Norris, who would have to come into the pits at the end of the lap
Yeah,
one, and that completely ruined his race.
yeah. So then, as we saw, then the run up towards after that very very long right hander, Verstappen was in the lead from Sainz. Then Hamilton was in P3. Then Alonso or Stroll was challenging Lewis Hamilton, trying to go around the outside. Then we saw Ocon go down the inside of Norris. So Norris was definitely starting to struggle. And then out of nowhere, we saw Stroll make a very good move down the inside of Hamilton and move up into P3. But then at the end of lap one, we saw Lando Norris come into the pits and make that pit stop to change his front wing because of that lap one damage.
Yep. On moving on to lap six, then we saw Sergio Perez become a man on a mission, trying
Yeah,
to chase down those podium spots after starting P11, and he disposed of Haas's Nico Hulkenberg on lap six. So
yeah,
that would be really crucial for him as he tried to make his way up through the field. He would have to overtake cars one by one, lap after lap. And then moving on to lap seven, also into turn one, we saw George Russell get ahead of Fernando Alonso, who
yeah,
seemed to be struggling quite a bit. So this was the first race of the season where we've seen Alonso look like he was struggling a lot, just genuinely with his car. And so that was pretty disappointing to see, but not for Russell because Russell had gained so many positions after lap one that he was flying. He
yeah,
sort of cut the track, but he went around the bollards properly and rejoined as the FIA had instructed him to do so. And so there was nothing wrong with what he did. And so it was really smart positioning of his car there from Russell.
yeah. Pretty much like it reminded me a lot of what we seen at the Russian Grand Prix, I think last time we were there, when Alonso just on the formation lap was testing how quickly he could go through the bollards. And then lap one, he just went straight through the bollard there and made up a couple of places. It reminded me a lot about that.
That was funny to see.
But on lap 8, then we saw Lewis Hamilton get past the Aston Martin of Lance Stroll, who had got him back during lap 1, and now Hamilton had finally got past.
And we also saw Lando Norris get ahead of Nico Hulkenberg, who seemed to be struggling quite a bit now.
Yeah, it was Oscar Piastri who got past, I think it was.
Oh yeah, it was Piastri.
Then on lap 9, we saw Sergio Perez then gaining on the Haas of Zhou Guanyu, and he went around the outside of the Alfa Romeo and then moved up into another place. Lap 11, then we saw another move into turn 1. It was this time George Russell who got past Esteban Ocon, so definitely a lot more overtakes this year and a lot into turn 1.
It's because of those two fast right-handers now to end the lap that brings cars so much closer onto this front straight. And speaking of closer, we saw 4 cars separated by a tenth of a second on lap 14. We saw it was the Haas, Alfa Romeo, and Alfa Tauri, so Sonoda trying to get ahead of Hulkenberg after Ocon had got ahead of Hulkenberg
because of the pit stops.
Yeah, and it was pit stops, and so Zhou Guanyu then was arriving on the scene, and so we were trying to make out who was gonna get out ahead, because some cars had cold tires, some cars had hot tires.
Yeah.
So it was nice racing, definitely.
Yeah, and so we saw Ocon then went flying ahead after Hulkenberg was holding up Zhou Guanyu, which allowed then Yuki Tsunoda to go around the outside, but then Tsunoda went pretty wide, which allowed Zhou to go back down the inside, and then Tsunoda then went again around the outside. So a really good move from Yuki Tsunoda to keep those places. Then onto lap 21, we saw Fernando Alonso making his way through the field, and he got ahead of Zhou Guanyu into turn 1. And then we also saw Oscar Piastri get past the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg as well, so he was also flying. Then 2 laps later on lap 23, we saw Pierre Gasly go around the outside of Nick de Vries into turn 1, and then he set his sights then on the Haas that was in front of him of Kevin Magnussen.
Whoever paid for the grandstands at turn 1, 2, and 3 really got their money's worth this weekend. So many overtakes into turn 1, and another overtake we would see Leclerc, who was struggling to fight back through the field, finally get past the Alpha Tauri of Nick de Vries. And while we saw that, we saw Max Verstappen come into the pit lane. Yeah. And while all of this was going on, mind you, Verstappen was flying out in front. He was a pit stop already ahead when he made his pit stop. So he was on course to lead every single lap of this race.
Yep. Then on lap 31, we saw Sergio Perez get past Fernando Alonso into turn 1. So Alonso was seeming to struggle, but not really, because it's just a much better Red Bull car. And then we saw also Sergio Perez get past Yuki Tsunoda into turn 1. Then he saw Sergio Perez get past his former teammate Esteban Ocon into turn 1 on lap 34.
Yeah, and before that we also saw Lewis Hamilton get past Carlos Sainz to go back up into second place. So that was an important move from Hamilton.
Yeah. Mercedes is having really good race pace, it seems like, after their okay qualifying pace. Now their race pace seems to be a lot better.
Yeah, it was definitely a lot better.
So then moving on to lap 35, then a really good battle between Sainz and Russell. Sainz at the last moment moved to defend Russell, but Russell just went down the inside on the medium tires, fresher medium tires, and he got past Carlos Sainz and moved up into the podium positions. So he dislodged Sainz from a home podium.
And behind that, on lap 40, we also saw Esteban Ocon get ahead of Yuki Tsunoda, and then we saw Kevin Magnussen get ahead of Valtteri Bottas. So it was just overtaking happening everywhere at the same time on this track.
Yeah.
And next lap, we also saw Fernando Alonso get past Zhou Guanyu in his Alfa Romeo. So really good move from Fernando Alonso.
Yeah, then on the very next lap, he went and got past Yuki Tsunoda into turn 1 again. So Alonso had moved himself up into P8 and chasing down Esteban Ocon. On lap 51, though, we saw Sergio Perez come into the pit lane then and make another pit stop. I think his second pit stop of the race so far, and he moved in onto the soft compounder tires to try to chase the guys ahead of him.
And it would be an important pit stop, because Perez would be instructed to push flat out to the end of this race so that he could chase down that podium spot. But meanwhile, while we saw Perez pitting, we saw Alonso trying to get past his former teammate Esteban Ocon, and Ocon aggressively and very lately moving to the extreme right
Yeah.
to it looked like push Alonso to the far right of the track, and Alonso using his quick reflexes just avoided contact and collision. But again, Ocon just looking like he wants to kill Alonso,
Yeah.
even now when they're out of the same team. Just absolutely, I think that's just pretty dangerous from Ocon at this
Yeah.
point.
So then, but during this whole time, the clouds were getting a lot darker and grayer. So the teams were watching out for rain, but the rain wouldn't come eventually. And lap 53, we saw Sergio Perez get past Carlos Sainz and move up into P4. And then lap 56, in the back, farther down the field, we saw Zhou Guanyu and Yuki Tsunoda have some really good racing, as then it looked like Zhou was going to go around the outside, but then Tsunoda forced him off the track, and Zhou went through the bollards, and he had to come back and rejoin the track just behind the Alpha Tauri.
And I think that was not a good. Sonoda got penalized for that, but I don't think that was a good call from the FIA because there was no touching.
Yeah.
Sonoda did leave a car's wet. Joe chose to go off the track, and so I don't think Sonoda should have been penalized for that. It was a real shame for the Japanese driver.
Yeah, he would lose his points paying position because of that penalty.
It was really disappointing. But also another funny thing that happened in the race was that as they were looking for rain, Russell pointed out rain.
Oh, yeah.
But then later on, he just realized that it was his visor that had been wet from his sweat. So it was just Russell sweating a lot because his hair got loose from underneath his
Yeah.
balaclava. And so that was just funny from Russell.
Yeah. So then after that, out in front, it was a very comfortable win for Max Verstappen, who led every single lap of the race. He took pole and he had the fastest lap as well. And Max Verstappen won the Spanish Grand Prix once again for Red Bull, and it was a very comfortable Sunday for himself. Then Lewis Hamilton came home in second place and a very good podium for Mercedes. And it was not just Hamilton; it was a double podium for Mercedes,
Really
as
was
George Russell also came home in third place to claim a podium for him, and that was a really good performance from the Silver Arrows.
Yep, and it would give them a lot of confidence going into the next races of the season. Behind Russell, Perez came fourth, getting close to Russell, but not quite close enough. And then that allowed Verstappen to extend his championship lead a lot.
Yeah.
Then Sainz came fifth in a decent home race for him and Ferrari. Then came the two Aston Martins, but it was Stroll ahead of Alonso.
Yeah.
So Stroll ironically at Alonso's home race, Stroll would beat Alonso. Alonso came home seventh, but he didn't mind.
Yeah.
He was willing to play the team game. He knew they were slow that weekend, so he wouldn't complain about it. Esteban Ocon came home in eighth after his podium in Monaco. Zhou Guanyu came home ninth, and then Pierre Gasly brought home another point for Alpine in 10th.
Yeah. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast, and be sure to join us next time as we take a look at the 2023 Canadian Grand Prix. Thank you.